In this week's Best in Class, we're featuring the top-ranked analyst on Apple, according to Bloomberg data. He's Gene Munster, joining us now, an analyst at Piper Jaffray. Gene, good to talk with you. The top-ranked analyst, also one of the top stocks right now in the markets, Apple. Okay, let me start off with Steve Jobs and his comments at the All Things D conference. I mean, he touched upon everything from Foxconn to iPads, iPhones, his fight with Adobe. I mean, did he clarify anything to you?
No, not really. He basically said the whole fight with Adobe is over. People are making a bigger deal out of it than they really should. The reality is that Apple's trying to build a protective moat around their app store, and so that's why they have this spat going on with Adobe.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's certainly of self-interest. He did a couple of things nuggets I wanted to take out of his comments, though. He did seem to allude there that the iPhone may one day be on a different network other than AT&T, or at least along with AT&T, right?
Exactly. I mean, that's the biggest negative here on the iPhone is the fact that it's limited to AT&T. When we survey potential iPhone buyers, that's the #1 reason why they don't buy an iPhone. It's on AT&T. So the fact that he said that that's open and that's a possibility down the future is obviously a positive for how the iPhone adoption could be, but that's likely not till 2011, so it's a little bit out.
Well, in the meantime, then, what does that do to iPhone sales? I've heard anecdotal evidence of people complaining about their AT&T service, but what does that do to sales then for the iPhone?
Well, you can still have a 50, 60, 70% growth globally because that's where the real growth is coming from, is from outside of the U.S. But so it does limit the opportunity in the U.S., I guess, for the next year with the iPhone sales. Until it gets on Verizon, I think that some of the really hyper growth is going to be limited. So to answer your question, is that sales are going to be fine because of the global opportunity, but they're going to be somewhat limited because they're limited to AT&T.
Okay. Well, speaking about global, we know that the Apple iPad was just released internationally, did very well. They came out with their sales figures. I believe they sold, 2 million iPads or something along those lines. How does that track with your own estimates, Gene?
Well, I mean, that was well ahead of what we originally anticipated. It was 1.3 million for the quarter, so they've already done 2 million with 2 months into it. So they're selling as many iPads a day as they are Macs. It's taken them 30 years to get that Mac run rate. Now within 2 months, they're selling that many iPads a day. Granted, it is the launch period here, so there is a little bit of a bump up you're seeing in the iPad sales. But the bottom line is this category, which people weren't really certain about if it was going to really take, is much more than a fad. This is a fundamental shift, the iPad is, in terms of how people are doing mobile computing. Right.
Steve Jobs, when he introduced it, called it magical. And I guess some who doubted him are eating their words right now. But in the meantime, though, do you think, Gene, though, that they're going to narrow down the number of models they have for the iPad? Are they going to mess with it, or are they just going to leave it as is?
Well, this is probably the same model for the next year. What's really going to change on the iPad in the next year is the number of apps. They have just over 5,000 apps that are optimized for the iPad versus about 200,000 that are optimized for the iPhone. A lot of those apps the iPhone apps can run on the iPad, but I think for the next year, that's the real change you're going to see, is just better apps that are going to allow you to get a lot more value out of your iPad.
Okay, and last thing, Gene, Steve also did mention the rivalry with Google, and he said, look, Apple's not really going to get into a search rivalry with the company. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm a little bit surprised at that, because if you look at Google and Apple, are big competitors. Apple basically gives Google a window into about 40% of their data, very important data as far as what mobile usage is. So it sounds like that, at least in the near term, I suspect that Apple's not going to get into any search. But I bet down the road, some mobile search, different than a destination search like Google is, but I bet Apple's going to do some of that optimization themselves down the road. The bottom line is this, is Google and Apple are going to get more competitive in the next 5 years.
Okay. All right, Gene, always good to talk with you and to hear your thoughts on Apple. That was Gene Munster, analyst at Piper Jaffray.